Well, welcome everybody. This is a virtual version of one of the presentations that I was supposed to do at the Focus on Inclusion conference, actually the last session. But as for those of you who were there, the snow got so bad that I was really worried about my ability to catch a plane out of Indianapolis. And as it turned out, even though we didn't do the last session and I left early, I barely made it out of Indianapolis late, but was able to get out of town with all that snow coming down. So I appreciate everybody's flexibility. I also wanted to say thanks to Jolly and Marcy and the whole crew at the IEPRC, who really had an amazing conference. It was really an excellent conference for those of you who were able to be there. And for those of you who were not, but can access the sessions through virtual opportunity like this one, hopefully it'll be worth your while. I know that you're going to be watching this either as an individual or perhaps with one or more people that you work with. And I wanted to say a little bit about the format of this before we go on. We'll talk in a moment about a professional reflection journal or personal reflection journal. This session is divided up into 8 or 9 blocks, if you will. After each block or topic area, you're going to have the opportunity to use your personal reflection journal to answer some questions that might help you analyze what we talked about and maybe set priorities for what you want to follow up on in your school district. The personal reflection journal will be you access it the same way you access this PowerPoint, consists of 3 questions. What aspects of the information we discussed is your district doing well? You might already be doing it. I might just be affirming stuff that you're doing. What aspects of the topic do you think could be strengthened in your school district? You're doing it, but maybe you want to take some of the information you heard here to make it a little more robust. And the third would be what next steps or actions do you want to take regarding the information that we discussed? You've been to a lot of conferences like this, and everybody always enjoys themselves at the conference or in a virtual session. But the worth of that information is really to what degree do you prioritize some aspects of it to either implement or use to strengthen the practices you currently have. So we will stop 7 or 8 times. You can pause this presentation and then restart it when you've finished that particular reflection. It'll make more sense as we go along. So the title of this session is basically, what are the must-haves for implementing MTSS? And we'll talk about what those mean in a moment. So there's some goals here. Understanding the importance of district level integration, not just school level. The impact of leadership types on an integrated multi-tiered system, but more importantly, the relationship between leadership type and student outcomes. How do we integrate academic behavior and social emotional learning into this framework? How do we understand interactive data? Interactive data are data that look at 2 things at the same time. Might look at academic proficiency and attendance. What is the impact of attendance on student proficiency? What is the impact of referrals to the office on student proficiency? What is the impact of suspensions on student growth? Instead of looking just at like fluency or behavior, we really want to look at relationships between 2 variables. So we'll talk about that. And then completing your personal reflection journal. So with that, we are going to launch right ahead and move into the topics. A few thoughts about MTSS. MTSS has been around quite a while. Here in Florida, we started implementing it in 2004, And by 2010, we were doing it statewide. It really has come into its own again because it was included in the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA Act that came out of Washington, D.C., and it was included in virtually everyone's ESSA plans. Much has been communicated about the definitions, critical components, implementation science. It's been implemented in small, rural, suburban, urban districts with varying levels of success based upon how it's implemented. So today we're going to talk about the must-haves if you want to implement it with success. And in some ways, MTSS has become so common that everybody thinks they know what it means, but I'm going to give you a little homework assignment to find out how well that's happening in your school district. I'm pretty sure everyone knows how to spell MTSS. I'm not sure everybody could really tell a naive person what it means in a very succinct way. So we'll work on that today. The must-haves are those elements that, if they're not present, will be barriers to successful implementation. Must-have are those elements that, if they are present, you have a much greater chance of being successful. The must-haves in this presentation today are taken from both research, implementation science, but also our experience over the last 15 years with implementing MTSS in school districts across the United States. And that's personal experience. So I'll try to separate out what's my personal experience from what is research-based experience. Remember that MTSS is a way of thinking. It's a framework. It's the framework where you take everything you're currently doing and put it into it. You supplies the content. Now, what you'll find when you do that is you may have a lot of stuff in your district that you can put into that framework, but you're missing some critical things. You may see some things you put into that framework that maybe you think, well, I don't even think that should be there. So remember, this is a framework and a mindset. It is not a prescription or an intervention. There are 6 critical components of MTSS. Leadership, capacity building and infrastructure, communication and collaboration, use of data, problem solving, and multiple tiers of instruction. If you've been looking closely, you saw little arrows going from leadership, capacity, communication, data, and problem solving to that multiple tiers of instruction. That is because each of those other components in the honeycombs contributes to the impact and effectiveness of instruction. So today, when we go through some of these, and we're going to start out with leadership, we'll have a question. How much does leadership contribute to student outcomes? The answer is, if it's the right type of leadership, a huge amount. If it's not the right type of leadership, not much. So these are not components that are here because it's a theory. These are components that are here because when they're present and done correctly, they increase the impact of instruction. And the only way kids improve in schools is with instruction, not how much adults sit around in meetings and yap about this or yap about that, unless the yapping increases the power of instruction. So please remember that as we go through this. There's a couple of different ways to look at MTSS. I think many of you are familiar with the triangle. And if you look at this, this is really 2 triangles put together. So one of the things that I want you to think about is that this should be a framework for how all students are schooled, not just students who struggle, kind of the left hand of this diamond. But I will assure you, and I think that when you think about this, you will agree with it, that even the highest performing students also need supports. Some of them need more than others. So we're going to talk about a multi-tiered system within all instructional environments, regardless of whether performance students are struggling or they're excelling. So one of the questions for you to think about is, what do you want your triangles look like? A triangle that conveys this idea that people think, well, it's really for struggling students, or that it's a way that we ensure the highest level success of our students at all levels of performance. So the 6 components of the MTSS framework are all aspects, academic, behavior, and social emotional instruction, fit into each of these. For those of you who are potentially doing PBIS or social emotional learning, there are multiple tiers of instruction. What do all kids get? What do some kids get? What do few kids get? We use data to see if it's working. We have to do professional learning to increase people's capacity to do it. There has to be communication and collaboration and leadership around all of it. And if it's not working, we have to be able to problem solve. Differentiation of the tiers of instruction and support are relevant to academic, behavior, and social emotional domains. All, some and few. As you go up higher in the tiers, the intensity increases. We'll talk about that. And data collection is used to document whether it's academic performance, behavior, or social emotional. So the idea that you would have a behavior team separate from an academic team, separate from a social emotional team, doesn't make a lot of sense. All of that is integrated into everything students do, and we'll see that shortly. Okay, let's review the must-haves real quickly. Leadership alignment and integration at the district level, how the district level is organized, effective leadership models, strengthening instruction and supports in Tier 1 first. Year 1 is Tier 1. Consensus and common language, common understanding of MTSS at the district, school, and classroom levels. Highly effective instruction in Tier 1 or universal instruction. Instruction that is impactful on diverse learners. Typically performing students, students with disabilities, English learners, students who come from environments that don't create, give them the greatest readiness to come to school. The district uses database decision-making and problem solving for deciding what it does. And the district implements a comprehensive MTSS evaluation model to ask this question. As we implement more and more of the MTSS framework, are students showing acceleration in their growth? There has to be a prevailing belief and understanding that the purpose of this work is to accelerate the performance of all students across academic, behavior, and social emotional well-being. This is all about equity and access for all students. The first thing is that all roads lead to instruction. Anything that doesn't improve instruction, we should really question, why are we doing this? Why are we doing it if we can't say the result of this meeting, the result of this data analysis, the result of whatever we as adults are going to do is going to improve the effectiveness for our students? Must have, number 1, leadership engagement. There are 5 things that need to be done at the district level in order to ensure successful implementation at the school level. The Board of Education needs to pass a policy stating that MTSS is the framework for schooling all students. The superintendent is the voice and the image of supporting the framework. The superintendent states explicitly and frequently how this framework guides the work of the district. The district strategic plan or improvement plan includes or incorporates the components of MTSS as actions to achieve strategic goals. There shouldn't be an MTSS implementation plan. The components of MTSS should be integrated into the district plan as the resources and tools to attain those goals. People at the district level who are responsible for supporting MTSS leadership in the district should have time allocated for that work. It shouldn't be something they do in addition to what they're already doing. So if somebody has 1/4 FTE, full-time equivalent, assigned to MTSS, that means that's at least 10 hours a week or more. If it's 50% FTE, half of their time, it's 20 hours, 2.5 days a week. And the district needs to develop its own definition of MTSS. So the relationship between instruction, behavior, and social emotional learning has implications for how we organize and integrate our district office because it reflects what we ask of students. And we'll talk about that more. You can, in a moment, when we pause, you can come back and look at some of this. But what I'm giving you here are examples. There are 2 examples of board policies for 2 different school districts that I've worked with on what a board policy looks like around using MTSS as the framework. So there are 2 examples of board policy. There's also an example of a district strategic plan and how they incorporate the components of MTSS in that plan. But also, please see here that in the vision and the mission, MTSS is mentioned directly as the framework for schooling. So this is what a vision and mission statement for a district implementing MTSS might look like. You can look at it more closely later. This is an example just from a district that I started working with last spring. And in October, they adopted this as their definition of MTSS. You want to do that so that the district has ownership. They own this definition. So they're more likely to put effort and engage it if it's their own. So this is reflection time number 1. I would like you to either review the slides we've gone through so far, go back and do a deeper dive, and then discuss those 3 questions that we talked about earlier around this information. The goal at the end of your reflection time will be on that 3rd question. What are your highest, number 1, number 2, maybe number 3, but no longer than that, no more than that? What priorities for action, if any, do you think you're going to walk away from this first section discussion? Okay, so you can pause the presentation and restart it when you're ready to continue. Welcome back. Must have number 2, leadership integration at the district level. So think about this. Just kind of take a breath, and I mentioned before that it does not make a lot of sense to have an academic team, a behavior team, and a social emotional team. And this is why. Put yourself in the body of the student. Put yourself in the brain and the mindset of the student. Every task we ask students to do has a skill component. Do they have the skill to do the task? Fluency. Do they have the algorithm for math? Do they have the social skills, self-control, self-instruction? Do they have an understanding of how they feel about something? Those are the skills to complete the task. Lots of students have the skills to complete the tasks, but they don't have the behaviors to organize and implement the task. This is not unusual with students who might have an attention disability. They have the skills, but they lack organization, maybe perseverance, stick-to-itiveness to implement the task. So we have actions, and these are just some examples here. One of the things adults can do to help students who don't have the behaviors is pre-teaching or pre-correction. It might also be social skills training to teach students self-talk, to break up a task so then they can complete it without stopping in the middle of it and forgetting to come back. So they might have the skills, but might not have the behaviors to implement it. They might have the skills and the behaviors, but they don't have the social emotional component to engage the task. What if they have the skills and the behaviors and they're just not interested? They think what you're asking them to do is stupid. They would prefer to do something else. So within that student, to be successful with things we ask students to do, they have to have the skills, the behaviors, and the social emotional capacity. It could be that a student is angry, depressed, afraid of something. And those emotional issues prevent the student who has the skills and the behaviors from engaging the task. So the idea that we have three teams operating as silos makes no sense to me, never has. And an MTSS framework should be able to integrate this. If you're having problem-solving meetings around academics, you need to have people at that meeting that also can support students who lack behaviors or clearly understand social emotional distractors or diverters. So I want you to think a lot about this. If all of these things occur simultaneously with every task, the more we have the adults at the district level and the school level who are responsible for these components separate from each other, the less we're going to integrate. Also, please remember, this is true for adults too, for all of us. When the demand of a task is greater than the student's skill level or the adult skill level, you can think of this as a student. You're giving the student a math thing. The student does not have the skills to do the task, is too demanding for the student's academic skills. Think about having a student in your class with significant behavior or social emotional issues, and the demands that that student is placing on you to effectively provide an environment that that student will be successful in, or at the very least manage the student. When you don't feel your skills are up to the demands the student is giving you, you're going to have both a behavior and a social emotional outcome. So for a student, it might be escape avoidance. I can't do this. I'm going to get the heck out of here. And they might act out to do that. They might just get up and leave, or even worse, they might just shut down and look like they are engaged, but they're not. Or they may act out anger, anxiety to increase their activity level, or withdraw. So kids who fall academically behind are more likely to find academic work aversive, and you will get both a behavior and a social emotional response to that. So we have to integrate these in all of our thinking about curriculum, about instruction, about supports. The counselors, behavior specialists have to be as focused on academic demands as academic people have to be sensitive to those behavioral and social emotional issues. Something I've mentioned in the past is many places, and Florida did this statewide, is they're implementing youth mental health first aid. That's an adult-focused skill development to be able to recognize social emotional issues as opposed to simply negative behaviors. For some kids, anger is really an indicator of depression. And it's really important for all educators. And in Florida, we've included bus drivers, everybody being able to recognize these things. So you might consider looking up youth mental health first aid. It is a U.S. Department of Education supported approach to this. But at the very least, it really lets us know that at no point can we look at just academic, just behavior, or just social emotional, or assume that kids act out when they get an academic problem to escape or avoid. There are lots of other reactions, other behavioral reactions, and surely other social emotional reactions than those two. So for everything that I just said, integration of leadership must occur within and across these organizational units. They cannot be separate. So reflection time number 2. Same thing. I want you to think about what was just said, what challenged you, what affirmed, what do you want to do as follow-up with this content? So pause the presentation and we'll see you shortly. Well, welcome back. This part you may find a little challenging. You might find super interesting, but it might be some new thinking for you. Effective leadership models are present that are empirically related to positive student outcomes and staff engagement. Leadership explains about 25% of what predicts student performance. What happens in a classroom, and that's not just the teacher, that would also be support staff, all the other teachers. What happens in the classroom basically predicts about 33% of student outcomes. If we round that up, that comes right at 60%. Now, those are things that we have direct influence over. Things we don't: home, community, development, parenting style, all of those types of things that we know influences students, but we don't have any control over. But what we do have control over is well over half of what does. And we should focus on that. So we're going to talk just a little bit about that. Leadership exercises 2 core functions: providing direction at the district level or at the school level, and exercising influence. Not mandating, collaborating, not clobberating, right? We'll see more about that in a moment. But we have to be realistic about what the purpose and function of leadership is. And it's providing direction and support and exercising influence. How much does the type of leadership matter? A lot. Collective leadership has a stronger influence on student achievement than individual or hierarchical top-down leadership. That collective leadership, you'll see the definition at the bottom, and I give you some resources in a moment. Teachers and administrators leading together, recognizing that long-term success rests on diverse perspectives and contributions. In other words, we all learn from each other. No one, particularly in education, has a lock on what should be done to help kids. It really is a collaborative problem-solving process. Higher performing schools award greater influence to teacher teams, parents, and students in particular. And school leaders have an impact on student achievement primarily through their influence on teachers' motivation and working conditions, ensuring teachers have the time they need to do the work, ensuring that the schedule for the building accommodates the needs of students. And it has more impact than their influence on teachers' knowledge and skills. Their influence on teachers' knowledge and skills produces less impact on student achievement. So I was a building principal for many years. I mainly focused on supporting, influencing, ensuring teachers have the working conditions. Teachers will ask for skill support or get it on their own or get it in their PLCs. But what they don't have control over is the climate that they work in to ensure a feeling of support. It's a risk-free rather than a risky environment. So collective leadership will get you the majority of that 25% of what influences student outcomes. If you don't pay attention to leadership, you're leaving 25% on the table. And now teachers have to pick up the slack and other educators, but they can't. They can't. So leadership that is not empirically associated with positive student outcomes creates an environment where success is very difficult and teachers feel overwhelmed. Teachers always want to do whatever they have to do to help kids be successful. But if they're already doing their 33% and the leadership doesn't give their 25%, it's not a recipe that's going to come out well. Rapid principal turnover has moderately negative effects on instructional climate, unless the new principal carries on what was working and that productive climate of the principal who is no longer in the building. Rapid principal turnover explains a modest but significant amount of variation, not in the good way, in student achievement across schools. So we don't want to have, a superintendent that has like 5 really outstanding principals who's turned schools around and start moving them to the schools that aren't in a turnaround mode. We want to ensure that all of the principals in a district have the skills to implement the leadership style that is most positive for student outcomes. The influence of parents and students is significantly related to student achievement. Student achievement is higher in schools where teachers share leadership, collective leadership, and where they perceive greater involvement by parents. That doesn't mean showing up at conferences or what have you. Their perception is that parents are involved and supporting their kids. Here are some resources that you can look at. So reflection number 3, this whole issue around leadership. What's the role of leadership? How much can a leadership style influence outcomes? How much do teach? Talk about that. Pause the presentation and come back when you're ready. See you in a few. Must have number 4. Consensus around a common language, common understanding of using MTSS as a framework. This is collaboration and communication component of those 6 things we talked about before. So we've talked about leadership. We're talking about collaboration and communication. I've mentioned a little bit capacity building. let's do a quick primer on MTSS. MTSS is a multi-tiered system of supports. We've already said it applies to academic and behavior. As you move up the triangle, regardless of whether this is that diamond or a triangle, instruction and supports intensify. But you got to have a definition of intensity that everybody understands and agrees on. So intensity has three components: time, the focus of the instruction, and the type. The higher up the triangle you go, the more time the student gets. The narrower the focus of the instruction, focusing on those barriers that are interfering with equity and access for students. And the type of instruction might have to vary. It might not. It may just be like tier 2, a double scoop. Some students need more time. The idea that all students learn at the same rate is false. Some students have to reread the material 2 and 3 times. They might have to have it retaught, not different ways, just retaught a couple of times. Please do not believe that if students in tier 1 don't get it, whatever it is, in the amount of time and in the way that the information is presented, don't think they have something wrong with them. They may just have needed a different way of presenting it. They may have just needed a double scoop with a focus on the area that they're struggling with. So don't assume that students with different rates of learning who can learn the material at different rates, don't assume that they have a learning problem. They just need more time. And we have to find that time. So once again, it applies to both of these triangles. Also, let's be very clear. Let's have a consensus in MTSS about where students in special education fit. This is the U.S. Department of Education's graphic. They fit at all tiers. Tier 3 is not special education. It's intensive instruction. And remember the difference between students in special ed with disabilities from students with disabilities on a 504 plan. The only way you can be a student with a disability and be in special ed is if you have demonstrated the need for specially designed instruction as opposed to accommodations. Both groups have disabilities. Special ed is exclusively for specially designed instruction. So we really have to be sure we know what that looks like, and we'll talk about that. Tiered system of supports. This is a mindset as well as a resource allocation. So if you're a district level person, if you're a building principal, if you're a teacher leader, please pay attention to this. MTSS is the answer to these 3 questions. What do all students need? What can everybody do to support all students? What do some students need? Tier 2. What can everybody do to support some students? And tier 3. What do a few students need? What can everybody do to support a few students? So district administrators, building principals, if the number of people available to support students in the upper tiers diminishes with the tiers, we have a problem. Meaning your most needy students have the fewest number of people helping them. That makes no sense. None whatsoever. Every general education teacher has a role to play for students getting tier 2 and tier 3 services, as well as specially designed instruction and English learning. Let me give you a behavior example. Let's say we have kids with a very significant tier 3 need level of intensity for behavioral supports. And those supports are in part teaching students how to use self-control, how to use problem solving. And let's say you're implementing skill streaming. Stop and think. Do I want to make a good choice or a bad choice? What are my choices? Pick a choice, do it, and did it work? The steps we teach kids to go through in order to maintain self-control and solve problems. That may be what the curriculum is in tier 3. But in order for that student to take that skill to tier 1 without that tier 3 provider being there, that gen ed teacher, when that person sees the student beginning to have difficulty in seeing some of those behaviors coming out, that gen ed teacher needs to be able to prompt the student, stop and think. Do you want to make a good choice or a bad choice? What are our choices? Let's think about that. So the gen ed teacher doesn't have to worry about having the skills to teach this to those students. That's not their job. But their job is to have a climate where they prompt the new skills those students have to come out in tier 1. So there's not a tier involved that doesn't require everybody in the game. That's going to be important because if these people, if the behavior specialist is off doing this stuff and the teacher's off doing that stuff and the special ed teacher is off doing something else or whatever, the counselor, everybody needs to be on the same page. It needs to be one approach to addressing the issue, and everybody in each tier has their role to play. This is not a handoff. It's not a relay race. It's everybody racing next to each other and trying not to knock each other down. Trying to move the slides. So tier 1, going to give an example real quickly. What everybody gets, tier 1 sets the scope, sequence, and pacing for all instruction in all the tiers. It sets the scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction for all instruction across all tiers. So the time allocated in tier 1 is the fewest minutes of instruction. ELA is typically 90 minutes. Algebra, middle school, high school, maybe 50, 60, or 100-minute block. Behavior, SEL.
Unknown.
Throughout the day, school-wide PBIS. The focus is the broadest. In literacy, it's the 5 big ideas. Phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. The same big ideas in math. School-wide PBIS approach, youth mental health first aid, we talked about that. The type of instruction should be universal. The instruction in tier 1 should be evidence-based for diverse learners. We'll talk about that shortly. And it has the fewest formal student assessments. Basically, benchmark assessments, grading periods, and end of year, end of course or grade assessments. So think about that, right? So the litmus test for common language, common understanding around the basics of MTSS, and we've only focused on the tier 1 part of it, but the intensity stuff we've talked about, et cetera, is if one of your colleagues at the district level or at the school level came up to you and said, I heard we're looking at implementing MTSS. What exactly is it? That you could give the 1-minute elevator speech to give them a basic understanding of what MTSS is. And that everybody in the district can give that 1-minute elevator speech in the same way that connotes the same message and the same meaning. So instructional alignment and integration across the tiers. So by the way, try the 1-minute elevator speech. All roads lead to tier 1. And we've said year 1 is tier 1. So that's why we're focusing on this. It sets the scope, sequence, and pacing for all instruction. It determines the curriculum, alignment to the standards for all students. Remember, all students, including students with disabilities, are held to the standards for the grade level or subject area in which they are enrolled, not their functioning level. Also remember that curriculum is what we teach. Instruction is how we teach it. Curriculum decisions are made more heavily at the district level. Instructional decisions should be made at the school and classroom level. Tier 1 sets the expectations for behavior, engagement, social emotional skills. The district's code of conduct applies to everybody. It determines the instructional and support strategies for all students, and it provides leadership and support for inclusive classrooms or not. So must-have number 5, include core instruction for all students first. Develop powerful intensified instructions second. You can't provide interventions that are strong enough to overcome a weak core instruction. So how do we know this? A strong relationship exists between the performance of all students and the performance of diverse learners. If you take a look at these graphs, you will see this is 4th grade in a district, and it shows on the left-hand side improved performance about 20% over 3 academic years for students in tier 1. Now look at the performance in that climate for students with disabilities. The slope of the line looks very similar to this line. Now look at this, another district nearby in the same state, grade 4 once again. This district has declining performance. And look at what's happening to students with disabilities. The fastest way to improve students with disabilities performance is to ensure a robust tier 1. So I would like for you to do your reflection now for reflection number 4, talking about this common language, common understanding around what MTSS is. It's a framework. We talked about the tiers being differentiated by intensity. We talked about what that meant. We talked about who's involved in the tiers. We've talked about the importance of tier 1 and where do interventions fit in. So look at the questions, have a conversation, pause the presentation, and we'll see you shortly. Welcome back. Must-have number 6. Highly effective integrated instruction and support strategies. Starts with tier 1. So take a look at this. And this I think is a really good recent 2021 example of effective instruction being a fundamental protective factor for social emotional wellness. Effective instructional strategies result in improved academic skills. Improved academic skills are associated with improved social emotional skills or feelings. And those are associated and can be supported with effective social, emotional, and behavior support. The idea that behavioral and social emotional wellness can occur in the presence of ineffective instruction is false. We don't want students behaving and feeling okay when they're failing. Now, I want to make a very important point. Effective instruction is not the same as an effective or ineffective or a good or a bad teacher. Effective instructional practices are the skills that teachers get or are exposed to or have equity and access in getting to apply to the needs of the students that they work with. So the district ensuring that all teachers have equity and access to effective instructional research and evidence-based teaching practices that are particularly effective for the students in the district. That's a district's responsibility. The curriculum office is curriculum and instruction. It's not just curriculum. A curriculum that is evidence-based for the demographics broadly defined of the students you have in the district, and the instructional strategies that are most effective for delivering that curriculum for the kind of students we have. Shouldn't be random. So how do we ensure effective instruction? There are a lot of ways, a lot of resources. Different districts use different things. An example is John Hattie's visible learning approach, which takes a look at all of the research that is out there on particular instructional strategies and looks at the performance of students who get those approaches and those who do not, and comes up with an effect size of how powerful that instruction is at different levels of accelerating student performance. So we could select instructional strategies that are evidence-based for the typical education gen ed classroom and the typical student, and then differentiate or refer to levels 2, 3, or specially designed instruction or reading support to boost students who don't get it. Or we could select instructional strategies that are evidence-based concurrently for diverse learners. As an example, using some of Hattie's information. Any of these graphs, we don't have time to go in great detail, but anything above 0.4 on this little meter represents increasing levels of effectiveness beyond just typical teacher effects. Direct instruction, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, has a good impact. Strategy-based instruction, which some of you may or may not have awareness around, has even more impact. But when they're combined, the impact is greater than each individually. An example of strategy-based instruction is collaborative strategic reading. The use of collaborative strategic reading in Tier 1 demonstrated significant growth in comprehension for typical students. It demonstrated similar growth rates for students with specific learning disabilities. And students receiving instruction in Tier 1 demonstrated greater rates of growth than students in more restrictive settings. So what this tells us is that instruction that is evidence-based for typical, in this case, and students with learning disabilities, particularly in the area of reading comprehension in middle school, can have equal impact on growth rates. You'll see here, these are the typical students. These are students with learning disabilities in ELA. You'll see that the rates of growth are the same. It's not closing the gap, but it is accelerating the performance of these students more than those same strategies or strategies used outside of gen ed classrooms. This is an example of strategic instruction model, content enhancement routines, applied to groups of kids that included, this is math, that included math achievement for students with disabilities, the orange, students in the lowest 25th percentile of learning gains, this canary yellow, and math learning gains overall. And all of this was applied in tier 1. And you see that students without disabilities who were in the bottom 25th percentile, as well as students with disabilities, all grew significantly just because of the instructional approaches selected for tier 1. The same applies to math. Enhanced anchored instruction has found that reducing combining errors and denominator errors for students with disabilities and without disabilities in inclusive and non-inclusive settings, and the students with disabilities in inclusive settings scored higher on the outcome measures. We also know that student-teacher relationships account for a significant boost to student outcomes. How teachers provide feedback is strongly related with student outcomes. The relationship students have with teachers is strongly related. Teaching students self-verbalization for self-instruction, self-guidance. Teaching students to think about how they think, and to some degree, metacognition is part of strategy-based instruction. So really what does happen with selecting the instruction and how that student-teacher interaction and relationships occur all contribute to academic, behavior, and social emotional outcomes in tier 1. High quality academic instruction. For example, content matched to success level, frequent opportunity to respond, frequent feedback by itself can reduce problem behavior. This opportunity to respond, frequent feedback, that's what behavioral strategies teachers use while delivering instruction. An awesome resource for these teacher behaviors during the delivery of instruction. These 7 are articulated beautifully by Kathleen Lane and her colleagues in this particular book, and I urge you to get it. In the schools and districts I work with, we do book study with this. One of these strategies a month for 7 months. Everybody has a discussion of what active supervision looks like, what appropriate instructional feedback looks like that will accelerate student outcome. And they try it for a month. They then come back together and talk about how it worked. What were the barriers to doing it? One strategy a month. In 7 months, you have these strategic behavior supports during the delivery of instruction that will accelerate student outcomes. A thing about social emotional learning. I think many of you are familiar with CASEL, the organization that is the national face of social emotional learning. Can visit their website. There are basically 5 domains of social emotional learning that can be applied in classrooms, school-wide practices, family and community partnerships. Each of these domains has specific competencies. And the competencies have a curriculum, if you will, instructional approaches to teaching it. And there are a number of sources for these types of competencies and domains. The CASEL is one of them. Many of the social skills curricula, like skill streaming, Second Step, if you take a look at the domains and the competencies in the CASEL model, you will find the same things in those social skills programs. So the point here is that we want to not only have the capacity to teach students these skills, we want to ensure that that tier 1 climate, teacher-student interactions, student-student interactions, are contributing to helping students manage and implement those behaviors, the skills expected of them, and promote social emotional wellness. So positive learning climates, here's one school district's definition: a pervasive culture of respect and collaboration. That collaboration keeps coming up again and again. Collaboration between administrators and teachers, teachers and students, schools and communities. High rates of positive interactions among all members of the school community, with a particular focus on teacher-student interactions. Motivating, participatory, and learning-focused. Participatory, opportunity to learn. Motivating, how we give feedback, instructional feedback, and active supervision. Learning-focused, growth-focused environment that promotes student ownership. An example of student ownership: instructional choice. Giving students choices with what and how they're going to learn. Well-managed, structured, and clearly defined practices, behavioral expectations, school-wide positive behavior support, safe and civil schools that create a climate of safety, fairness, and productivity. So let's boil this down to go back to some of Hattie's stuff. Classroom structure, classroom climate, culturally responsive practices, classroom social emotional learning. Classroom structure and cohesion is a highly effective, can be, practice that in and of itself contributes to increase student performance. Predictable schedule, clear expectations, student and adult rules clearly stated, not just student rules. Consistency across the tiers, particularly for instruction and expectations. We don't want students being taught one thing in tier 1, being taught another thing or with a different instructional materials in tier 2 or 3 or in specially designed instruction. We want students having the same message regardless of who and where the instruction is delivered. And that message should be aligned with the scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction in tier 1. SEL approaches. CASEL strongly promotes teacher instructional practices that have SEL embedded. Kathleen Lane's model, that book from a few minutes ago, is a good example of how to give supervision, effective supervision, how to give student choice, how to ensure opportunity to respond, which is an equity and access issue, So basically, we're looking at the impact of effective instruction on student wellness. You saw that 2021 study a few minutes ago that effective instruction is the foundational protective factor for social emotional wellness. Integrating it with academic and curriculum areas, not only in content, but also, once again, the skills that teachers have to ensure that students, particularly when they face adversity, feel supported, feel safe, and feel like they can succeed. Organizational, culture, and climate strategies is the third area that CASEL wants us to take a look at. The impact of classroom structure, climate, and student teacher, we just saw that. and then explicit SEL skills instruction. Some kids do not come to school with having had the opportunity to learn those skills before coming to school. So we have to provide foundational instruction for those students who come to school without those skills before we start implementing a code of conduct with consequences, some of which are exclusionary, that assume all kids come to school with this set of skills, which simply isn't true. So everything we've talked about so far fits wonderfully into the CASEL model. Teacher instructional practices, integration with academic curriculum areas, the organization, culture, and climate, and then explicit skills instruction. What I am hoping you're not doing is having some SEL curriculum out there that students work their way through without the other three components of this. It just won't work. So, reflection 5. Take a few minutes or longer to apply those 3 questions to the content that we've talked about here in the last 10 minutes. So pause it now, and see you shortly. Welcome back. Must-have number 7. Instructional design and delivery process that integrates A, B, and SEL. Remember, every academic task that you ask kids to do has a skill, a behavior, and a social emotional component. All 3 must be considered when designing instruction. So this is really talking about how do you lesson plan. One of the most effective ways to lesson plan is to organize your lesson planning around the 3 principles of universal design for learning, UDL. And those 3 principles are things you already think about, but sometimes they get left by the wayside. Principle 1, not all students learn the same way. So have multiple means of presenting material. Strategy-based instruction, the steps in strategy-based instruction are a good example of that. What we want to be sure in principle 1 is that it results in students having equity and access to the content. So let's say that a student in 6th grade has a fluency level at the 3rd grade level, but clearly understands 6th grade words, just can't read them. Multiple means of representation. If you are requiring that students have to read a grade level passage or grade level content, and you know that this student doesn't have the fluency to do it, then give that student another type of access. It could be text to speech. It could be a variety of things. Principle 2, different ways that your students can demonstrate their knowledge and skills. Some students may be able to write something out. They might be able to write an essay. The student who doesn't have the fluency is not going to have the written language skills, the spelling skills to be able to write an essay, but very much may be able to tell you the answers to the guiding questions. So speech to text, oral presentations, a whole variety, graphic presentations, a whole variety of ways, and then provide multiple means of engagement. Now, you may not like what I have to say here. I've never fully, I'm going to put it this way. When you say the words culturally responsive instruction, and you ask that of 10 people, you're going to get 20 answers. To me, it's an outcome issue. Does the instruction and the curriculum, the way we deliver it, the content of the curriculum, how students are given opportunities to interact with that, does that result in engagement by diverse learners? That's what it means to me. So if we're going to use curricular content that half of our students don't have background knowledge about, that's one thing. If we are expecting students to engage in learning that has no relevancy to their life, that's another example. If we expect students to engage and demonstrate what they know in a way that is not part of their culture, or it also could be a student that had a social emotional issue around performing in a certain way. And we know that. And if we limit those ways of engaging the curriculum and the instruction, then students are not going to engage it. So all of this has to be considered when we design our lessons before we deliver that instruction. So I'm going to just give you a quick example here. And you might try this. And when we do this kind of presentation for a longer period of time than an hour and a half, we engage in practice activities. So I'm going to give you some steps. You can come back and try it later if you want. Get out a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen. Put the paper under your dominant side that you're going to write with, right hand, left hand. Now I want you to think about a lesson in whatever area you teach in that you're going to be teaching tomorrow or the next day. You've already planned it. You're ready to go. When you have that lesson in your head, I want you to pick up your pencil or pen and put it over the paper, put it on the top of the paper and close your eyes. Now I want you to see yourself delivering that lesson to your class. When you see yourself doing it, without opening your eyes, I want you to write down the first name of the students who are not engaged. And now, not to deliver a guilt trip or anything like that, but if you use this exercise when you're lesson planning, why would you plan a lesson about how you're going to present it, how the students are going to respond to it, and whether it's relevant to the students, when you already know that 4, 5, 6 of the students are not going to engage the way the lesson's been designed? It's okay if you do that up front with lesson planning, because now you have the time to say, this is all great, but we've got 5 kids that are not going to respond to this. Fine. Plan ahead of time before you deliver the lesson on what you're going to do differently for those kids. It may be you're going to offer different ways of the material being presented, and kids have equity and access. Maybe you're going to give kids different ways to demonstrate what they've learned. Some kids might want to do an essay. Other kids might want to act out the answers. Other kids might want to do a graphic delivery of it. And then look, think about your students. Is this content something that they have background knowledge in? And if it's not, then give them the background knowledge first, which is the first step in strategy-based instruction. So this is really us seriously taking a look at how we lesson plan, how we make the decisions about how we're going to deliver it, all the options students are going to have for demonstrating what they know, and really thinking about student background, both external and internal, social, emotional, and thinking about whether this is an engageable lesson, or how do we expand it, change it to make it, but all that ahead of time. In other words, you would never prepare for a football game all during the week without knowing the team you're playing and adjusting your methods to work in that environment. So that's all about that. Now, within a multi-tiered system, how do we integrate all this? A good example is once a month, grade level and subject area teachers, PLCs, departments, what have you, they do their lesson planning for scope, sequence, and pacing for a month. Nowadays, most lesson plans are put on a Google Drive and everybody has access to them. But in that once a month meeting, the people providing tier 2, tier 3, specially designed EL, reading, math support, they're listening to understand what the content, the scope, sequence, and pacing is going to be in tier 1 for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks. They then gather to plan their instruction in the context of what they heard in that planning meeting. Level 2, 3, SDI, EL, reading, math support, they communicate what they're going to be doing with the tier 1 teachers. This is the collaboration and communication. And finally, if there are instructional providers, whether they're academic, behavioral, social, emotional, providing instruction to students outside of tier 1, then those individuals need to observe regularly how their students are doing in tier 1 to see if the instruction outside of tier 1 is making a difference and is calibrated for what is happening in tier 1. Indiana has some really nice guidance around lesson plan alignment template. It's been around for 8 years. You might want to take a look at it. I want to just show you how 8 years ago, Indiana did a great job of ensuring people thought about what we just talked about. So after going through grade level, standard, the learning targets, relating the learning to students, etc., assessments, you get down to resources and material. What technology and media tools will be used to deepen this lesson learning? Well, it could be principle 1, multiple ways of representing what is presented. Media and technology could be one of them. It could also be principle 2, how we allow students to demonstrate what they've learned using different methods. Access and engagement for all. How will you ensure that all students have access to and are able to engage appropriately in this lesson, not separate lessons? Remember, the curriculum is for all students. The standards is for all students. So this idea of utilizing the principles of UDL to ensure access to and engagement, principles 1 and 3, UDL is built right into this lesson planning model. And here's the coolest thing. Differentiation and accommodation. What evidence-based strategies for differentiation for all students? You read that right. Well, we all know that we can't use differentiated instruction for all students. We'd never be doing instruction for all students. But think about this concept of universal instruction we've talked about. Pick instructional strategies that are evidence-based simultaneously, like collaborative strategic meeting, like strategic instruction model, like enhanced anchored instruction. So these are not new concepts. In many ways, with this lesson plan, Indiana has led the way in infusing these mindsets into steps 8, 9, and 10. But basically, they are the use of universal design for learning. The best way is to integrate 8, 9, and 10 into 5, 6, and 7. But it's there. So food for thought. So reflection 6, think about how you lesson plan. Are you lesson planning for everybody or for some students and then hoping tier 2 and tier 3, special ed, especially designed instruction, reading support, that behavior supports, that they'll pick up the slack. Everybody needs to know what's going on in tier one. Everybody needs to contribute to it. So stop, look at those questions, pause the presentation, and see you in a few minutes. Must have number 8. I'll give you a break in your head now. You're not going to have to do so much work. Using data to demonstrate the relationships between critical factors, behavior, classroom cohesion, relationships on student outcomes. Academic engaged time is the best predictor of student growth. That is why the tiers are differentiated first by time. Students who need tier 2 supports need more time exposed to instruction than students who are successful with tier 1. Students needing tier 3 supports need more time exposed to instruction than students needing tier 2 and tier 1 supports. This clearly speaks to school schedules. Schedules need to have time built in for all 3 tiers. Integration of academic engaged time and behavior. Behaviors that result in a loss of academic engaged time. Attendance, referrals to the office, off task, suspension, social emotional factors. Kids are there, but they are not emotionally, they don't have the emotional capacity that day or that week to engage in instruction. So it's academic engaged time. What metric do we use? The behavior, days missed. If number of referrals, percent on and off task. We want to convert those frequency measures to a loss of academic engaged time. Let's look at how to do that. So chronic absenteeism is defined nationally. If you're interested in this, go to Attendance Works on the internet. Is defined as 10%, missing 10% or more of available school days. This graph from Attendance Works shows the impact of multiple years of chronic absenteeism on beginning 3rd grade reading fluency scores. And you can just look at these and see what happens on the left if you're not chronically absent, and what happens in the blue based upon how many years you're chronically absent. And by the way, in most places, the students with the highest level of chronic absenteeism is in kindergarten. So this clearly shows the relationship between attendance and student outcomes. These are data from a large school district that we worked with a number of years ago, showing the impact of attendance, types of attendance on elementary, middle, and high reading proficiency scores. And you can see that the greatest impact of poor attendance on proficiency occurs in middle school, the least in elementary, and the median one in high school. And in part, this is because whether kids are in school or not, they're exposed to language, they're exposed to words, not so much, particularly in elementary, where the complexity is not as great as middle or high school. Now take a look at this graph. This is the impact of attendance on math. Students are exposed to a far greater extent in written and spoken language than they are in math. Most parents who read their kids' bedtime stories from the time they're little, don't use that opportunity to practice math facts. So what we find is that attendance has a far greater negative effect on math performance than it does reading performance. So using these data, attendance isn't a one-size-fits-all. Because of the spiral nature of math, this is the one example where high school doesn't have a recovery. high school has a recovery over middle school when we look at the literacy, 57 to 66. It doesn't, the loss continues in high school, which talks about kids who are at risk in math coming out of middle school are probably not going to make it in high school. And in particular, if they have attendance issues. But here's the biggie. The biggest impact in this school district of 100 schools and 50,000 students over multiple years, 5-year period of time, the biggest adverse impact on academic performance was students with chronic problem behavior referrals to the office and removal from the classroom because of the loss of academic engaged time, plus the fact that when we remove students for behavioral issues, there is a huge behavior and social emotional component to that that doesn't exist at nearly the level when a student simply does not attend. Any behavioral consequence has a strong behavioral and social emotional component to students, negative, which hugely impacts academic performance. This is a study that is cited on the PBIS website, national website, conducted in Wisconsin, published a couple of years ago, showing the impact of reduced suspensions by, to some extent, all students, Black African-American students, Hispanic students, and students in special ed over a 5-year period of time, and the resulting higher rates of accelerated academic outcomes. And you can take a look at that, see as the suspensions went down, that the academic performance increased. You can also see that the blue line, Black African-American students had the greatest reduction, steepest downward slope of the line in suspensions, and they had the greatest increase in accelerated academic performance on the right side. So think about that. In this study as well, same study, over that 5 or 6 year period of time, administrators saved 601 days of administrative time, considering that the amount of work it takes for suspension, paperwork, process, all of that kind of stuff is about 45 minutes per suspension. And students, the ones that accelerated, recouped 10,525 cumulative school days from the reduction in suspension. Let's go back and look at the data again. So administrators who are not spending the 601 days administrivia for each of the suspensions, now they have time to support 601 days of things like school climate, work with students, a whole variety of things. And these students who, all of whom accelerated their performance, did so in part because of increased academic engaged time. They're back in school. Actually, how much increased academic engaged time? 10,525 days. So we need to start using metrics. Instead of saying X number of referrals to the office, X number of suspensions, we need to convert it into lost academic engaged time, because that's the instructional implication of these issues. So think about this. What kind of data are you using? Is it interactive data? Can we look at behavior's effect on academics, attendance, etc.? So talk about it and pause me right now, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. The last one. MTSS, database decision-making. When we look at the different kinds of data we have in schools, there's basically 5. Early warning systems, health and wellness checks, benchmarks, formative progress monitoring, summative, and of course, end of year, and systems level assessments, things like disproportionality, risk factors, and MTSS implementation and student outcome data. MTSS is a growth mindset model, not a discrepancy model. As long as you're growing and closing the gap, we have highly effective practices. If you're growing but not closing the gap, those are kind of questionable. If you're going the opposite direction, those are poor. So early warning systems look at attendance, behavior, credits, and school climate. And it is a predictive model for predicting who's going to be in trouble before they get there. So if your school district doesn't have an early warning system approach, please Google early warning systems, and you will find the work of Bob Balfance and others to really increase your capacity around this area. It's not just using data around early warning systems, it's what the district and the school's protocol is for what will be done when a student shows this early risk. An MTSS evaluation model, we want to look at level of implementation of MTSS. The self-assessment of MTSS implementation is a nationally evidenced progress monitoring tool. Fidelity of implementation, fidelity checklists, professional staff engagement, this capacity building. Are we providing the appropriate instruction and supports for mindsets, skill levels, perceptions of practices? Are we measuring that? How does the parent, the caregiver, community support, satisfaction surveys, school climate surveys, and student growth data, longitudinal data? So we have comprehensive assessment models. We have perceptions of practices, tools. We have fidelity checklists. They exist. We have belief surveys. We know how to do student growth. We can use the self-assessment of MTSS implementation to measure levels of implementation, and we can do school climate surveys to ensure that staff and student wellness is at appropriate levels for while undergoing this implementation process. Here's an example of some work that was done a few years ago, Los Angeles Unified School District, integrating some of this. These 2 columns represent high and low implementing schools within the same district, utilizing the SAM, level of implementation. These were teacher responses to teacher perceptions of practices associated with MTSS implementation. This was a measure of student growth. So in high implementing schools, 40% of the teachers said they were using problem solving to develop root causes for performance they were concerned about. Only 20% of the teachers said that was a practice in low implementing schools. Let's look down here. Teacher receives staff support to implement instructional plans. 40% of the teachers in the high implementing schools agreed with that. Only 14% in low implementing schools. The last one, data were collected to ensure fidelity data, that the plan was implemented as intended, or the instruction was implemented the way it was supposed. 60% of the teachers in high implementing schools said yes, 14% no. This is a growth score. Both groups of schools grew, but the high implementing schools outgrew the low implementing schools by 50%. So it is true that level of implementation, teacher practices, perception of practices are directly related to rate of student growth. So reflection 8. How are you measuring MTSS implementation? Does your data system contain all 5 of those elements? And one other comment. Teachers and teacher teams and building principals should not have to dig for data. They should be given data in a way that answers the question of whether or not things are being implemented at a low level or a high level, and the type of student growth, that positive, growing, closing the gap, growing, not closing the gap, or getting farther behind. So some concluding comments. If you have equity in access, curriculum, and process, you will attain equity in outcomes. So access, classrooms where inclusive instruction exists, universal instruction. Inclusive schools where parents and community know they're welcomed because they are part of the process of schooling. And collective leadership practices ensure that courageous conversations can occur because safety and trust truly exist. Equity in process, instructional planning that embraces the principles of UDL, problem solving that's culturally responsive. Teaching and learning is reciprocal, where relationships between teachers and students facilitate deep engagement in the process of student, and collaborative, right? So equity and outcomes occurs when growth models replace discrepancy models. Mastery learning replaces competitive learning. Predictive data keeps students on track along the way before student failures remind us to get them back on track. Improvement is not the end game. Closing the performance is. If improvement alone is the goal, we sell students short. They can improve while falling farther behind if the rate of expectations exceeds the rate of growth. Equity in outcomes occurs when we end the predictability that so often defines our expectations for children and youth who learn differently. If we predict that they are not going to do well, then the system, and they don't, then the system has not served them. Only when we break this predictability will we have done a service for all kids. So finally, Asa Hilliard, the risk for our children in schools is not a risk associated with their intelligence. Our failures has nothing to do with IQ, nothing to do with poverty, nothing to do with race, language, style, the need to discover a new pedagogy, or with children's families. We have only one problem. Do we truly will to see each and every child in this nation develop to the peak of his or her capacity? It is my fervent belief that the framework of MTSS, along with all the things we've talked about here, are the best ways for that will to turn into action. I hope this was helpful and productive, and thanks for dropping in.